Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we are continuing our look at Frederick William, the Duke of Brunswick, and the Herzoglich Brunsweigich Corps, perhaps better known as the Black Brunswickers or the Black Legion. Now, as that last attempt shows, if you're here for spot-on pronunciations of German, then you're definitely in the wrong place. But I'll do my best. I'll also try and use the English where possible, not to offend my German listeners too much. In the first part, we looked at how this unusual formation came into being, and if you've not seen it, then you might want to go back and watch that one first and catch up. But if you don't mind jumping in halfway through, or you've already seen that one, then welcome to part 2 of the Duke and the Army of Brunswick. Now, when we left off in part 1, the Black Brunswickers had fought 2 engagements in 3 days of 1805 against the Westphalian forces that now occupied their homeland. They were then whisked to safety by the Royal Navy and taken back to England. We saw that Frederick William, the Duke of Brunswick, was the brother-in-law and also the nephew of the King of England. So there was a real feeling in the country that we should help these Brunswickers. There's also, this comes a bit later, but there was also that romantic notion of these freedom fighters fighting against the hated tyrant that was Napoleon. Britain was the only nation still at war with the French in 1809, and they were engaging French forces in the peninsula. So the Brunswickers would have to end up there if they wanted to continue fighting. But first, they were posted to the Isle of Wight, just off the south coast of England, to undergo the necessary retraining, re-equipping, and reinforcing. Again, as we saw in part 1, the army and the Dukes of Brunswick were closely allied to the Prussians since at least the 7 Years' War, and I think that it's a safe assumption that they were organised and trained in the Prussian manner. This went by the board, however, as soon as they were in England, because as 1806 proved, the Prussian drill was hopelessly outdated. Now, luckily, being classed as light and skirmish infantry, Britain was the perfect place for the Brunswickers to learn modern combat techniques. Now, I point out here that when I use the term skirmish infantry, that's used as a term of convenience. Like, no one at the time would have used that phrase. I use it to differentiate them from light infantry, who often, especially for the British and French, by the Napoleonic Wars era, just operated as line infantry. They had the ability to skirmish, but most of the time they just acted in line or in column, depending on obviously what the situation or what army they were in. By skirmish infantry, I mean, and I'll mean on this channel, that troops who almost universally operated in individuals, or well, pairs it would normally be. So things like Jaegers or rifles, cazadors, things like that. And in this case, obviously, for the Brunswickers, we're talking about their Jaegers. Now, here's something else that I also want to bring up before we go any further. A lot of the contemporary sources refer to all of the Brunswick troops as Jaegers. Even the, quote, line infantry are called Jaegers. When I'm talking about the Jaegers, I'm talking about the Scharfschützen, the sharpshooters who are armed with rifles. So if I talk in this and the following, at least one part, about Jaegers, I'm talking specifically about the sharpshooters armed with the rifles. Anyway, the Legion was divided in 2, the infantry and the cavalry. Now, it should be noted that the Black Legion wouldn't serve together as a single formation for the next 6 years until the Waterloo campaign, being scattered across the British Army. We'll go into that a bit more when we get to it. The cavalry were classed as hussars and were equipped as such with curved sabres and pistols, while, as we said above, the infantry were classified as light infantry. Now, equipment-wise, the Brunswickers were also in the perfect place. Britain would end up arming and equipping most of Napoleon's enemies by the end of the war, and here they were given uniforms of British cut, but in black. Now, it was dark green for the Jaegers, and British equipment, especially water bottles. Again, if you've seen the first part, they captured a lot of equipment from the Westphalians, but one of the things that the French never issued was canteens or water bottles, very weirdly. They would use like goods and captured ones and things like that. So it sounds a silly thing, but it was actually quite important. They were also rearmed with the famous Tower pattern musket, the Brown Bess, or for the Scharfschützen, the Baker rifle. While the Brown Bess was unquestionably a better weapon than the French equivalent, as we saw in the first part, many of the Brunswicker riflemen used their own personal weapons. They would have been gamekeepers and hunters and things like that from the Duke of Brunswick's estates. So, there's the chance to personalise the rifles in your figures, maybe make them look a little bit fancier. They're also presented with British-made backpacks, which looked exactly the same as the ones that the British infantry had, although these ones had quite a cool-looking Horse of Hanover on the back. British packs were notoriously uncomfortable, so I'm sure that was of little comfort to the soldiers who had just traded in their French ones. But I think there's a possibility there for some conversion work, or just to personalise your troops a little bit. Have some that have kept their French packs that they captured at the Battle of Ulper. Now, thus having been re-equipped, the Legion needed to make up the losses suffered in their march to the sea. Now, obviously, there was no opportunity to recruit patriotic Brunswickers from the villages of the Isle of Wight. All the best recruits that did turn up in England were snaffled up by the King's German Legion. So they set their sights lower, and I mean much, much lower. Now, anyone that's read the Sharp novels will know that... Well, actually, I think it's only in the early ones. I think this got retconned later, which is a bit lame. But anyway, magistrates at the time would sometimes offer, convicted felons a choice of punishment or transportation, perhaps, or they could enlist in the army. And it was from these, quotes, volunteers that the Brunswickers were reinforced, and they could come either fresh from the courtroom or from the prison hulks that were lying off the Essex and Kent and presumably the Hampshire coasts. Now, again, anyone who's read Great Expectations will know that these hulks were decommissioned, demasted ships that housed prisoners in dark, overcrowded, squalid conditions. Not exactly a great recruiting ground for effective soldiers. Another place that they would receive their recruits from was from prisoners of war. And, these guys, you would volunteer to get out of the prison camp, I'm sure, or even the prison hulks. Again, not necessarily out of a love of the Duke of Brunswick's cause for freedom, let's put it that way. Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers here, but the quality of the new recruit, shall we say, would have some ramifications down the road. Sir Charles Oman, who seems to really not like the Brunswickers, and Nafziger, two very prestigious Napoleonic scholars, were all... Nafziger wasn't massively impressed either. He said, quote, "The initial force consisted of Prussians who were good, well-trained soldiers, but the campaigns in Spain gradually reduced this. The replacements were of German and other extraction and were the, quote, worst recruit. The better material was always sent to the KGL. They were a motley crew, much given to desertion. On several occasions large parties went off together. They could not be trusted on outpost duty, but they rendered good service in battle." End quote. Now, we've mentioned that they were trained and equipped in the British way, but again, this is disputed. I have read that on the battlefield they would form up in 3 ranks, unlike the British 2, and use a 3rd rank as ad hoc skirmishers. So that's very much what the Prussians did. I'm not sure how much I believe this. They were in the British Army. They had a year retraining and re-equipping in the Isle of Wight. Then they were shipped out to Spain as well. But, I present it as an alternative. If you do this in your war games, if you think that they were more likely to use the Prussian method, then if your rules give the British a bonus for their firing, then I wouldn't apply that to the Brunswickers, because usually that bonus is for the extra muskets that the 2 ranks bring to bear. Anyway, now fully back up to strength, the Herzoglich Braunschweigich Corps were formally renamed on Christmas Day in 1809 as the Brunswick OL Light Infantry Regiment. Yeah, anyone who's just heard me try and pronounce that word will be pleased to hear. Adding the OL's part to the Brunswickers is, it's fair enough, given that all the money for the Legion originally came from the Duke mortgaging his possessions in that area, but just for ease, I'll probably refer to them as the Brunswickers going forward. Additionally, the OL's bit was historically part of it was an area of Hanover, which was the personal possession of the British King. Now, I'm sure that whenever the Brunswickers needed some more equipment or some more funds or some better recruiting, and it went up to the king, I'm sure that they emphasised the OL's bit just to drive home that connection. Now, as I said, they I believe that they had the British drill and British formations. Some people disagree, and one of the reasons that they do disagree is because what is indisputable is that the Brunswick Light Infantry was made up of 12 companies, not the usual 10. Now, one of the 12 companies was a Grenadier company, and another formed the Light Company. Weirdly, it was the third company that were the Light Company, and as I said before, we're going to refer to those as Jaegers. And obviously, there were 10 what we call centre companies, or just sort of regular line troops. Now, each company had, big breath here, one captain, one lieutenant, one ensign. Now, in the flank companies, they had an additional lieutenant instead of the ensign, 5 sergeants, 5 corporals, 95 privates, and 2 drummers. The Grenadier Company also had an additional 2 fifers. So that gives a company strength of either 110 or 112. It is worth pointing out, however, that these are paper strengths. Any formation at the time, it was very, very unusual for them to get anywhere near their paper strength, particularly for the British. I think the only one that I can think of off the top of my head is the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. They should have had 1,000 men in their battalion, and I think they had about 850. But the vast majority of them were maybe 50% if they were lucky. Now, additionally to the 12 line companies, I guess we could say, there was a headquarters company which consists of 14 officers and sergeants. That would be 1 colonel, 1 lieutenant colonel, 2 majors, 1 paymaster, 1 adjutant, 1 quartermaster, 1 surgeon, 2 assistant surgeons, 1 sergeant major, 1 quartermaster sergeant, 1 pay sergeant, and 1 armourer sergeant. Now, it's a bit weird. I give you that stuff just because when we talk about these units, we often talk about how many soldiers there were and things like that. But we often forget about the headquarters element, and they can make quite nice dioramas, either for your brigade commander or your regimental commanders. And it gave a total of 1,348 men in the regiment. The establishment also shows 1 supernumerary colonel, 3 supernumerary majors, and 1 supernumerary quartermaster. And this was probably a way of drawing rations and pay for people who had come with the Duke of Brunswick, who weren't necessarily, part of the fighting regiment. Unit size for black powder wise, now I always go with the classic ratio of 1 in 20. So I would suggest that leaves us about 5 or 6 figures per company. Now, as we see later on, the Legion didn't operate as one entity. So if you're building an army that has a company or maybe 2 companies attached to it, then you want to go for about 6 figures. Or if you've got more than 1 company, then you need to do like the ratio of 6 figures. If you've got 5, then you want 30 figures, so on and so forth. That covers the infantry. The cavalry had a smaller unit, as you would expect, numbering only enough to make 6 troops. The usual number was 10. Now, each troop had 1 captain, 1 lieutenant, 1 cornet, which was the cavalry equivalent of an ensign, 1 troop sergeant major, 5 sergeants, 5 corporals, 95 privates, and 1 trumpeter. In addition, there were 15 officers and sergeants in the headquarters, which was made up of 1 colonel, 1 lieutenant colonel, 2 majors, 1 quartermaster, 1 paymaster, 1 adjutant, 1 surgeon, 2 assistant surgeons, 1 veterinary surgeon, 1 sergeant major, 1 pay sergeant, 1 armour sergeant, and 1 saddler sergeant. And that gives us a total of 675 men in the regiment. Now, I've also read that they had 4 supernumerary captains and 9 supernumerary cornets. Presumably for the same reasons as the infantry ones. These would be maybe the sons of noblemen from Brunswick and things like that, who were not quite fighting age or fighting ability yet, but it was a way of drawing pay and rations for them. Basically, it's the same as the infantry, just these ones were probably a little bit more posh. Now, it's more realistic, I would suggest, to split the Brunswicker Hussars into 2 standard size units of maybe 12 to 14 figures, under the assumption that while the regiment had 625 men on paper, they would not always all be mounted or in a condition to fight. Now, the Brunswick OLs was originally allocated as a single entity to the 4th Brigade for their campaigns in Spain, and the 4th Brigade was commanded by Colonel Pakenham. In 1810, the situation in the peninsula was a curious one. The British had been driven out of Spain, culminating in the retreat to Corunna and the death of Sir John Moore, but they were also in the south in a heavily defendable position on the outskirts of Lisbon, the famous lines of Torres Vedras. British mastery of the seas, and Lisbon being a port, allowed fresh troops to be landed almost at will, And so it was that after a year of refitting and training, the Brunswickers disembarked in Lisbon on the 8th of October 1810, before moving into the line on the 12th of November. The Black Brunswickers were back, baby! However, the regiment would not remain together in Portugal. While the 3rd Company, the Jaegers, were kept by the 4th Division, 2 companies, the 2nd Company and the 10th Company, went respectively to the 1st and 2nd Brigades of the 5th Division, while the other 9 companies going to the 2nd Brigade of the newly formed Light Division, under, friend of the channel, Black Bob Crawford. This distribution of companies tells us something about how at least the armies, the generals on the ground, saw the Brunswickers. They were originally to be deployed as a regiment. This was decided by Horse Guards in London. Now, I've talked about Horse Guards before, and I think a few of my listeners were a little confused, especially those whose English wasn't their first language. I obviously didn't explain it clearly enough. Horse Guards refers to the retired generals, the politicians, the accountants, the staff that form the administration of the army. It's named after the army headquarters on Horse Guards Parade. It's not a regiment of Horse Guards. That's something different. Horse Guards with a capital H, basically. These often had political considerations. So the nephew of George III and the brother-in-law of George, the future George IV, had to be handled with kid gloves to a certain degree. His regiment, regardless of quality, had to be kept together, as to do otherwise would be something of a slap in the face. The generals at the front, however, they really couldn't care less about this, and so divided them up, presumably with Colonel Pakenham having first dibs. This is hinted at by the fact that the most useful company, the elites as it were, the Jaegers, stayed with his division. The 2 sent to the 5th almost certainly filled a skill gap for light troops, while the rest were being sent to the Light Division. Now, we look back on the Light Division now as something of an elite formation, but it's worth pointing out at the time, in 1810, those units weren't necessarily considered elite. We've talked in previous series about how the Rifles, for example, the 95th, often received the less desirable elements from other regiments. If you've not seen the video on the Rifles, go and check that out. I'll talk in length about that. It's my opinion that by placing the bulk of the regiment in the Light Division, it was something of a, we can get away with it because they are officially classed as light infantry, but we need to put them somewhere that they can't do too much damage. And we'll put them with the new Light Division. There'll be a lot of friction with the enemy. That's that rubbing up against them, doing small actions. They'll either get good or they'll be wiped out. Either way, it's a win for the British. However, whether he wanted them or not, the Duke of Wellington and Black Bob wasn't going to let them lounge around doing nothing. And after only 5 days on the line, they were at the head of the pursuit as the French withdrew from the lines of Torres Vedras, engaging them in a skirmish around the French base of operations Santrem 2 days later on the 19th of November. That would be it for 1810. The 2 sides would then move into winter quarters, although, without doubt there would have been small-scale actions, patrols, things like that would have occurred between the 2 sides. A great source for skirmish gaming, not least against the dastardly Loup Brigade. Again, that's a sharp reference if you didn't know that one. Finally, however, after a pretty miserable winter in 1810, the start of 1811, the darling child of victory, Marshal André Massena, ordered his starving French army to retreat, first north and then east back across the border into Spain. As might be expected, it was the Light Division that spearheaded this long pursuit, catching up to Marshal Ney at Redinha on the 12th of March and again at Casalnova 2 days later on the 14th. Just a quick side here, Ney's handling of the rear guard was absolutely superb. At one point, Wellington thought he was facing the entire French army, not just a single division. It's something which a lot of people just know Marshal Ney for the mistakes he made. Maybe they know him as like a brave dude in Russia and a guy who made loads of mistakes at Waterloo. But this is an aspect of him that really shows him at his best. In the Osprey campaign book for Fuentes to Oñoro, which incidentally is an awesome book. It's about one of my favourite battles in the Napoleonic Wars, and it's my favourite battle in no small part because of how good the Osprey book is. The author says, quote, Ney achieved his objectives. He had protected the rear of the army, his own corps rearguard had been safely withdrawn, and Wellington had been delayed by a full day, end quote. However, the army couldn't avoid the British forever, and on the 1st of May 1811, the French attacked the British positions on a ridge behind the village of Fuentes de Oñoro. Now, the Brunswickers had been moved out of the Light Division by this time, and were in fact part of the 1st Brigade of the newly formed 7th Division. This is in almost no small part, I'm sure, to General Crawford's very, very low opinion of the regiment. So unimpressed was Crawford with the Brunswickers that he actually said if they wanted to desert, then he would give them a pass to do so. He would literally write them passports to desert to the French. For we would, quote, be better without such. So absolutely not a fan of the Brunswickers, but perhaps a little harsh. They formed part of the 1st Brigade under Colonel Halkett, which consisted of the 1st and 2nd Light Battalions of the King German Legion, and the 1st Battalion of the 6th, the 1st Warwickshire Regiment. The Jaegers remained with the 4th Division, and the other 2 detached companies stayed with the 5th. Now, we don't really have many accounts of what the Brunswickers got up to at Fuentes. The main regiment, probably being kept largely out of the fighting, formed up next to the British 51st Light Infantry. The Jaegers and cavalry did get involved, however, the latter suffering 8 casualties, with Adjutant Lieutenant William von Zollikofer and 6 of his men being wounded and an additional man killed. More egregious than this, though, were the 10 prisoners that they had taken from their ranks. I mean, I say prisoners, if Black Bob's anything to go by, possibly deserters. But let's go with prisoners, shall we? Just to big up the Brunswickers a little bit. They wouldn't. Following the victory at Fuentes de Oñoro, the Brunswickers would next see action in the 1st siege of Badajoz. The 1st British siege of Badajoz. Although, more specifically, one of her satellite forts, San Cristobal. This was on the 9th of June, 1811. An attempt had been made on the fort 3 days prior by other units from the 7th Division, notably volunteers from the 51st Light Infantry, who we saw that they formed up with at Fuentes de Oñoro, and the 85th Infantry Regiments, with Grenadiers from the 17th Portuguese Line Regiments making up the numbers. Again, this is a further suggestion of a snub of the Brunswickers. Storming parties were usually made up of volunteers as picked by the commander of the storming division, with the Forlorn Hope in particular being seen as the place of honour. Of course, it had a very high chance of injury or death, but by not even allowing volunteers from the Brunswickers, they were denied any chance whatsoever for this most glorious, this most prestigious act. That said, however, they did still return casualty figures of 7 dead on the 9th to the 6th, so it's possible that either a number of Brunswickers went along as part of the Forlorn Hope, perhaps unofficially, or they were killed manning the trenches opposite the walls by fire from the defenders. Maybe, cannon shots that went long, things like that. Wellington fought a number of sieges in his career, and to be perfectly honest, it was not a strong suit of his. Thus, after the failure on the 6th, another assault was called on the night of the 9th. This time, however, elements of the Black Brunswickers were in the forward parties. I would suggest probably the Grenadier Company. Again, however, the assault failed, costing the Brunswickers 6 wounded, including Lieutenant Julius Lewinsky and 1 more dead. Due to the armies of Soult and Marmont massing for a relief effort, the British fell back to Portugal, and in an attempt to wrong-foot the French, moved north to face off against the other great border fortress, Ciudad Rodrigo. There they would stay for the rest of the autumn and winter, although the 5th Division and the 2 companies of the Brunswickers attached to them were involved in the observation of the fortress, fighting several skirmishes with French probes, even French probes in strength, attempting to gain intelligence about the locations of the majority of Wellington's army. While I have got no specific examples of this, I think it's reasonable to assume that the Brunswick Hussars were doing something similar to the French. They would be trying to discover intelligence on the French positions as well. Because, like I say, I've not got any specifics on this, but that's the bread and butter work of Hussars. That's kind of what they do. This resting at the winter of 1811 would allow for some more reinforcements from the prison hulks and prison camps and recuperation, so that by January 1812, the 9 companies of the 7th Division numbered around 700 men, and the individual companies probably numbered around about 50 to 70% strength. So that means that, your units should be, if you got 700 men, 1 to 20, you're looking about 35 figures. So you could either go with one large regiment one large battalion on the tabletop for the 9 companies, and maybe a small or tiny unit of perhaps 6 figures 5 or 6 figures, 4 to 6 figures, there you go, for the individual companies. Now that is where we are going to leave it for this episode. As New Year's Day 1812 dawns, the British are on the border with Portugal and Spain, with the Brunswick OLs rested and prepped to assault the first of the 2 keys to Spain. While confident in their abilities, 1812 will be the largest test for the British Army in nearly 100 years, and will follow the Black Legion as they set about redeeming their reputation and forming their legend. I was hoping to turn this episode into, this series into like a 3-parter, and this episode being the whole of the Peninsular War, but we're already running to half an hour. I've gone into quite a bit more specific detail in this episode than I did in the previous one, and I think it goes to show that certainly an English person looking at these, a unit that enters British service, there's a lot more information about than there was about their 1809 campaigns with the Austrians and then up through Germany. And there's going to be at least one more part in this series, probably 2, if I'm honest. One covering their bloody adventures in Spain, and the other the muddy carnage of Waterloo. So that's it for today. I just want to let you know before I go, I've got an affiliate link with the Outpost now. They're very kindly helping to support the channel. The link's in the description down below. If you click on that and buy anything from the Outpost, it doesn't have to be Napoleonic, it can be anything, then a very small percentage of the sale comes back to helping the channel. So if you are looking at picking up anything soon, then please use the link down below. Just a note of warning, however, their supplier can be quite slow getting the stuff in. So if you need something super desperately, might not necessarily be the way to go. You might want to go with someone else. But if you don't mind waiting a couple of weeks, then and you want to help out the channel, get 20% off your order, and the Outpost is an absolutely superb place to go. Also, don't forget, we are now doing midweek episodes as well, so check back on Wednesdays for those. If you're not subscribed, then please do. Turn on the notifications, and you'll be told about when the Wednesday... occasionally they might slip to Thursday, it depends if I get a chance to do them during the week, but it means that the Wednesday night ones you'll get the alerts for as well. But that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.